Helen from the Socialist Alliance. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the Going Home, Staying Home reform plan, which I think was conceived by Perkins. Now, my understanding is of that plan, the reform plan, is that refuges that were formerly specialist women's refuges are being closed down in favour of generic refuges. Now, previously the specialist women's refuges attracted women and children fleeing violent relationships, and they were offered psychological, financial and legal counselling, as well as clothing and furniture, because many of them flee their homes taking nothing with them. Now, these generic refuges obviously are going to have a lot of men who perhaps have mental illnesses, and I see that as a disincentive for women to access these refuges, because if they've been sexually or physically abused, they're not likely to be wanting to go into a refuge where there are men who perhaps are drug affected or alcohol affected. Also, these refuges, the tenders for the generic refuges, I think, have favoured religious organisations which are more likely to counsel women to stay in violent relationships because marriage is sacrosanct. So isn't this Going Home, Staying Home reform plan more of a disincentive for women to flee violent relationships?
I haven't implemented the Going Home, Staying Home reforms, but I'm happy to answer the questions. Yeah, look, for those of you who aren't aware, I did refer to them briefly. Going Home, Staying Home reforms were implemented in July last year. They've presented significant upheaval for the homelessness service system in terms of the way in which packages have been provided for services to provide them, how they've constructed how services work together, and it has resulted in a significant upheaval for the entire system. In terms of your question, I think there's three peaks. There's Homelessness New South Wales, there's Domestic Violence New South Wales and Y Foundations, and we've been campaigning significantly over the past year around the homelessness reforms. And we held a forum on Monday to talk about the issues around domestic and family violence. Look, some of what you're saying is right, and some of what you're saying is a little bit is not so right. In the packages there are women's services, so the issue isn't about men being in the services. The issue is actually about a range of the lack of specialist domestic and family violence services. So there's a service for women, but it may be women with complex needs or women who have experienced domestic and family violence all in a service together, rather than men being mixed in, if that makes sense. So there has been a move away, or there is a lack of specialist domestic and family violence refuges as a result of the reforms. So what we were asking on Monday, what we've been bringing the sector together in to discuss, is around the blueprints, which Women New South Wales is currently developing, which is a blueprint for domestic and family violence, and trying to really push for, firstly, acknowledgement that the homelessness system is really the major response to domestic and family violence in terms of providing services to women and children in the service system. And secondly, to really make sure that there are enough services that provide specialist domestic and family violence support for women who are escaping domestic and family violence. And that includes the services that you're talking about. So it includes specialist child support, specialist trauma-informed care. Yeah, so that's what we've been pushing for, and we are pushing over this period. But yes, so yeah, does that answer the question?
Do you really think that there's a role for religious organisations to be running these refuges?
All right, look, the first thing to say...
for women and children.
The first thing to say is that before the reforms, religious organisations provided women had refuges as well. The issue there is making sure that they provide quality services that are putting women and children first, and that they can demonstrate that. So our view is that what we've heard from the sector, from talking to the sector, is the tender process and the competitive tendering and so on was a huge upheaval for the service system. And so what we've got in place now is what we've got in place, and we need to make that work the best it as best we can, and that means making sure that we have quality services with specialist support for women and children who have experienced domestic and family violence. So the faith-based organisations have always provided services in this space, and it's about making sure that they provide the best quality services for the clients, and make sure that they put women and children first. And so that's what we've been working on within the system. In regards to that last question, Mary, and sorry, I've forgotten who your friend's name is. Katherine. There was a rather alarming article on the issue in a publication called The Saturday Paper, written by Wendy Bacon about 6 months ago, pointing out that LCs had been handed over to church organisations, saying Coffs Harbour and various other women's refuges that were formerly feminist run were now being run by church-related organisations. But leaving that aside, I just want to promote my own product. I get paid a pittance for handing out the City Hub every week, and I've brought in copies for the last 4 weeks and no one's picked them up. And the 1 week when I didn't bring in enough, there's 4 articles on housing, so blow me down. The first one refers to the new laws related to strata titles, that if 75% of the strata title holders want to flog off the building they're all living in, then to a new property developer, then the other 25% who are likely to be long stayers, older people, will not can be outvoted and can be made homeless by increasing rents and all sorts of things, or restructuring of it. And anyway, it's on page 3 of the City Hub there. Also on page 3 is the last remaining residents of the Rocks. The 800 left out of the original 2,500 were having a small protest at this welcoming Barangaroo Park, which has been much feted about, where they welcome the community, and they were just throwing little paper planes around with "Save the Rocks" on it, and 6 security guards descended on them and threw them all out. And overkill. Anyway, it's in the City Hub, the details of that one. And there's a third article about how the City of Sydney, and their desire to achieve low-cost housing for low-income workers, not homeless or retired or pensioned or unemployed people, but workers, i.e. probably fire brigade workers, nurses and police, who are regarded as, even though most of them are on 50 to 60 grand a year compared to 20 grand a year on social services, that it looks like this housing project the Sydney City Council is embarking upon, with over 250 units costing $50 million, is being done in partnership with Salvation Army. And the lesbian, gays, transgender and etc., I don't know the full acronym, are jumping up and down saying, oh, the Salvos, one of their staff in Oasis resigned when one of the girls was told to pray rather than have homosexual tendencies, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, they're the 3 articles that are covered in the latest City Hub. My question to you is, I've heard rumours that this new building down on Broadway, this wonderfully, alternate housing that's gone up there, that a lot of rich, wealthy, middle-class Chinese students were offered flats at $200,000 each and were not put out to the open market anywhere. These are little tiny student flats, which obviously their parents were paying for, and they're exclusively offered to the Chinese students coming in. Now, every time they mention infrastructure in New South Wales and freeways, they talk about 2 million more people coming to Sydney in the next 10 years. Why don't we house the people who are here first before we talk about 2 million more people coming into Sydney? And why don't we house them with the thousands of empty flats that are owned by people that don't live in them and just bought them for speculation and are claiming tax deductions on them? And why can't we go back to the 70s when there was groups of people going around kicking in doors of empty flats and moving homeless people in there? A bit of political action if the government's not going to act.
Bring back the squats!
Can I just draw your attention to the work that Shelter is doing, and that we're saying if this city is going to grow, what urban development takes place, we want there a place for everybody in it, including the poorer folk. And we need there to be a fairer distribution of our resources in order to house our community. So I think there's sort of a lot of political statement there, but there's also an awful lot of work going on around how you might step by step intervene in order to ensure there's a place for everybody. But what we do need in this process is the likes of all of you and many, many voices hounding your local members, hounding whatever. I'm glad the Hub's carrying those articles because it's good. The more news, the merrier. We really do need to make it an issue, not just for the likes of Katherine and I to argue, but that mainstream Australia is saying this is a problem.
Well, on my way over here, I've never seen so many cranes up in the sky. And as Jefferson has said, there's a lot of building going on here. Now, my question is this. Why aren't we doing, and I'm not sure what city it is, but it's either London or New York, where every new apartment building that is built has to have room for people who haven't got a home. It's as simple as that. You're talking about the RHETORIC boss. I know him well. We lend money to him. He makes billions, and he can afford to spend several $100,000 without even shedding an eyelash. That's what you should be focusing on. Getting the government off their backside to get these people to put some of their huge profits back into society. They're not doing it. Do it.
Some of that sort of investment happens in the United States because their tax system is incredibly different and benefits or actually encourages that sort of investment from wealthy people into a housing system. Our tax system doesn't do that. Our tax system encourages a more selfish approach. So it's like you can't compare apples with oranges sort of thing. But there's an awful lot of work going on about trying to get our tax system to operate more fairly, so that instead of escalating prices, it brings it down. And to try and get the investment in our housing changed so that we get investors who are interested in long-term investment in secure housing rather than short-term investment into property simply because it's a wealth-creating asset and for capital gain. There's plenty of policy settings that will change all of that. But we actually need that really serious thing called political will. And we don't have it. So that's when I come back again to my point about we need more than Katherine and me sitting here. We need all of you and many others to start to say to your, just wherever, to your local members of parliament, letters to the paper, whatever. This is a problem and you need to do something. We need to really ramp up the issue about political will because to date, both our major parties have been pretty light on commitment in this area. And I could be rude enough to say, you know, the property developers and what have you got off with the first fleet and they've been here ever since. And New South Wales politics and housing has been shaped by that ever since.
In 1989, I started renting an apartment in the Department of Housing in Lilyfield. I'm still renting the same apartment. And I've observed my neighbours change. When I first rented that apartment, there were a lot of pensioners, there were a lot of relatively quiet, but not totally dysfunctional people. Now it seems like the entire apartment, I hope people excuse me for saying this, it feels like my entire apartment is full of loonies. There's someone in the floor above who sounds like 6 people. There's a Vietnamese guy who keeps fighting the war in Vietnam over and over again at top volume at 3 o'clock in the morning. You get the picture. Would you like to comment in terms of what you said a little bit earlier on about the narrowing of the criteria for access to public housing?
Your experience is like that of many people living in public housing and living next door to public housing. And what happened in a real sense is during the deinstitutionalisation process in the 70s and early 80s, a lot of the institutions for people with disabilities and the institutions for people with mental health problems were deinstitutionalised, but very little was done about housing. And so you had this new cohort of people in the private markets unable to house themselves affordably, a narrowing public housing system, as in it had less money in it and it couldn't grow the way it used to. So then you got a prioritisation. People went, well, this rare resource called public housing has to be rationed to those most in need. And so step by step in the process of attrition, the eligibility criteria for public housing got down to be something very narrow. It's no longer good enough just to be poor. You have to be poor plus plus plus. And as a consequence, you do get concentrations of people in the public housing estates that have a range of pretty specialised and a lot of problems and pretty difficult, yeah, and you know, some pretty difficult lives to lead. That's what you get out of not planning for what's going to happen to people, not providing adequate support, not thinking through the housing thing. And I could come round now to the NDIS argument, because yet again we're having a process happening where people with disabilities are being promised something that they're not going to be delivered on. There has been no attention given to long-term, or to the needs for people with disabilities to get long-term secure housing out of the NDIS process. Yet again, we're going to look at that sort of hardship happening again.
I'd just like to refer to the Homelessness Bill 2013 and its absence of a rights-based framework. The bill merely aspires, it establishes an aspiration that all persons in Australia have access to adequate housing. And do you agree that this is incompatible with Australia's international human rights obligations, which we've signed up to, under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, where Australia has an obligation to take steps to achieve progressively the full realisation of the right to an adequate standard of living, health and well-being, including food, clothing and housing. The idea being to create a society where housing is a guaranteed human right. What are your feelings about that? And just following on from that, a generation of new adults face a situation where their quality of life will not match that of their parents. Student debt, precarious employment, 0-hour contracts, the impossibility of ever realising the Australian dream of owning their own home unless they inherit. Now, will they perhaps form a constituency in the future for a fight for real tenants' rights, enshrined in the law and in the Constitution, rent controls, security of tenure, long-term leases, social housing? Is that our hope for the future?
Can I say that is music to the ears of any social reform practitioner in Australia, and I'm very pleased to hear somebody articulate it so eloquently and so comprehensively. One of the things that we're looking at doing, and Kathy Vaughan's the director of this piece of film that's going to be made soon. There's going to be a day in the life of a homeless Australian person, and it's going to be based on the Gwyneth Paltrow sliding doors concept of the parallel universes. So it'll be a day in the life of a homeless person in an Australia such as we have now, where there is no legally enforceable right to housing. And the nearest thing that we've got to is, as you've correctly identified, a bill wafting around in Canberra ever since 2013, which contains no legally enforceable right to housing. And then the parallel universe, then it's the same day and the same life of the same person, but in an Australia where there is a Homelessness Act which contains a legally enforceable right to shelter in the same terms as Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the ICCPR as you've quoted. So I think you need to be our creative director for that particular piece of filmmaking. So more power to you.
In terms of the first part of the statement, really, of course we agree with what you said. In terms of what we're looking at population-wise, but the age pension is predicated on the fact that people own their own home, and we're looking at the beginnings of, you know, a huge shift in terms of how people will be living. People will be renting privately for the majority of their lives and won't have assets. So we are looking at, if something isn't done, a huge change in how people live their lives, and a system that doesn't actually respond to that. So hopefully, I think hopefully you're right, and hopefully this will mean that there will be some movement around the fact that housing should be a human right and it should be affordable. Yeah.
Okay, you talked about Miller's Point Housing Commission, but you didn't talk about Redfern, the ghetto, and then Suicide Tower in Surrey Hills. Are we talking to build buildings like those, buildings built already, which most of the residents are not happy living there? Even the children from the migrant parents, they'd rather to be in that at their place, because I've worked with them before. So what is the plan? Miller's Point, we let people living there and have been living there for a long time in a posh area, which so many people living really housing commission is a ghetto now. It's we just build housing, but they disregard the mental health of the people living there. People just, that's not a proper solution.
No, it's not. And that's been something that happened because of the way in which there's been no growth, and there's been targeting to the needy of the most needy, and a lack of money into the system. So in a way, it's not a good outcome, but it is the consequence of it. With Miller's Point, there's a different argument there. We've met numerous times with the tenants down there, and many of them are our members. Many of them, not all of them by any stretch, but many of them, that property used to be owned by the Maritime Services Board, and it was worker housing. So many of them have lived there for generations. It's been their family home. It was their community. It got transferred to Housing New South Wales as the Maritime Services Board folded up, you know, 20 years ago or something. And the understanding when it was transferred was that those people would stay there, it would still be their home. So in a real sense, the government has reneged on a commitment that was made to those people at the time, and they've used their lack of maintenance as the reason for doing that. So for them, I think, in the Miller's Point instance, something very harsh has happened in the way in which a community has been broken up and the hardship caused. You know, and a lot of the things about what a community does that builds strength and where people support each other hasn't actually been valued by government in that process at all. So, for example, the family with the young person with a severe disability who managed to live perfectly well because everybody else there knew her and could help and support, etc., was moved to somewhere else. Yes, the new house was nice enough and all that stuff, but the community was really isolating because they no longer had the informal supports, and certainly government wasn't going to pay for the level of support that used to be provided informally. And that sort of tale has been told time and time again as the Miller's Point tenants have been moved. The community support that they once had cannot be replicated by government. And you know, from my point of view, I think what happened down there is incredibly harsh, and it didn't need to happen that way.
You were talking about amendments to the Tenancy Act. What about the people who are boarders? Because I've spoken to a lawyer recently, and I had some trouble at my place, and I got really good help from the Tenants New South Wales. Yeah. But the big question was, are they allowed to come in, or do you keep the key if you're, you know, all of this kind of thing. A very, very subtle, fine line, blurry line between being a tenant and being a boarder, because it seems that the Tenancy Act will protect tenants, but boarders seem to have no rights whatsoever. It's pretty much analogous to unions protecting full-time workers, and all of these casual people, which is probably about 60% of the population, have no protection at all. Will the Tenants Union, will the Tenancy Act think about protecting boarders? And one would hope that unions might think about protecting casual workers, seeing there's so much on the increase.
Since the Tenants Union New South Wales was established in the mid-70s, it argued long and hard for back then that the law was the 19th century law, and it was pretty rough. It was a very feudal law, and we argued long and hard that the new law needed to incorporate boarders and lodgers as well. That argument was lost. The government did reform for tenants. It significantly left out some very key areas of reform, notably to do with some sort of moderation or control of the rate in which rent increases could happen, and relating to what we call some better degrees of security of tenure. So a just cause eviction, there had to be a specified reason for your eviction that had to fit certain categories to try and give tenants some greater degree of security and at least a reason for arguing when they were asked to move. Anyway, those two things, some sort of thing about rent, some sort of thing about security and private rental, and boarders and lodgers, we've never won those arguments. So, you know, the tenants union has argued and will argue again long and hard for that sort of coverage, but we haven't managed to get political acceptance of that. And the landlord lobby has worked incredibly hard to ensure that there isn't coverage for those things.
My question, I suppose, fires on a little bit of what Kathy has asked, and I think what has been mentioned by some of the other questions. I'm a psychiatrist, and so my question is actually focused on the boarding houses for the mentally ill. And the mentally ill that we're talking about are essentially people with schizophrenia. Now, in the 60s, there was a progressive movement, as we all know very quickly, to close down the old, terrible, huge institutional psychiatric hospitals, and under the Richmond report that people would then be housed in really good quality housing, public housing, with plenty of, you know, all the support that people with that very serious illness would need. That did not happen. It's one of the disgraces of government policy. And since that time, for a little while, there was at least some inspection of the conditions of the boarding houses where these folk live. That has disappeared. My understanding is that in these so-called boarding houses, there is no inspection, there is no way in which the authorities would know whether there are violent, people with schizophrenia with a violent edge living, the actual physical qualities of the boarding house. It seems as though these people have been completely abandoned, and the only people that are making money, of course, are the boarding house owners. So my question is, it's a disgrace, but does this connect at all with what your organisations are doing? And are there other organisations that are lobbying for a proper responsibility by government to at least have regular inspection so that the quality of life is being held to properly established standards? Or isn't anybody now really taking any responsibility for these boarding houses for the discharged, predominantly schizophrenic patients?
There is work being done, so you're absolutely right in terms of the legislation is not being enforced. The legislation is actually quite good, it just it needs to be enforced, and so there's been a lot of work being done in terms of working with the state government around making sure that the legislation is enforced, and also looking at the role and responsibility of local councils in that space as well. One of the issues too is that councils have responsibility to enforce it, but they get no benefit from doing that. They often find themselves having to go through court, etc., to take on the boarding house owner, and it costs them a lot of money. So there's no real incentive for local councils to do that. So yes, there are groups who are lobbying around that and trying to work into making sure that the legislation is enforced and also reviewed, because it was amended relatively recently. The other issue in that space is that ageing, disability and home care are responsible for that particular piece of legislation and area at the moment, but it won't, following the rollout of NDIS, ADAC won't exist. And so we're also asking what's going to happen once NDIS is fully rolled out, and who's going to actually be responsible for making sure that the legislation is implemented properly.
Which would be the Labor Shadow Minister responsible? And is there a member of the Parliament, a Greens member, who's actually taking responsibility for lobbying on this where there seems to be such terrible neglect of the most vulnerable of our citizens?
Yeah, we've been talking to Tanya Mihalich, who's the shadow for housing on this issue, but also the members where there's a lot of boarding houses. So Jenny Leong is a good person to speak to, and also Joe Halen. So Joe Halen's been trying to do some work in question time around boarding houses, and particularly around this issue in the Act. So I would suggest you speak to Joe Halen and Jenny Leong.
question about the effectiveness of the going home, staying home reforms. My understanding is that part of the strategy was to keep people at risk of homelessness out in the suburbs in Greater Sydney and not have them come to Central Sydney. So because there hasn't been a lowering of people coming to Central Sydney who are homeless, doesn't mean that the going home, staying home reforms have failed.
That's a really complex question you've just asked. In terms of inner city drift, yes, you're right. There was the way in which the resource allocation was devised was based on the assumption that the reforms would actually prevent inner city drift. As we all can see from walking around the inner city, that hasn't occurred. There's a number of reasons why that's failed. The issue that wasn't looked at with inner city drift in the first place is it's not just specialist homelessness services that need to be located in other areas, it's actually also mental health services, drug and alcohol services, a whole range of services that aren't available, and there are specialist services of these kinds in the inner city. It also didn't, when Going Home Stay Home was implemented by the government, they also didn't develop any planning around how they were actually going to move, if they were going to move services from the inner city to other areas, how they were actually going to enable that to happen, and how that was going to be done in a planned way. Following some lobbying, as you would know, from a range of services in the inner city, there was the Inner City Restoration Fund announced by Upton as part of the response to the fact that the reforms weren't as good as they weren't delivering what they were supposed to be. And from conversations we've been having, we don't anticipate that the Inner City Restoration Fund will disappear beyond the contracting period, because there's no work being done, as far as we can tell, by the department around inner city drift and even discussing the concept of inner city drift. The other issue with inner city drift is there was, in planning the reforms, they spoke to the big homelessness organisations about moving their services out. Through Going Home, Staying Home, if you look at where the footprint of the big services, they actually haven't increased in Western Sydney and South Western Sydney, which is where you would be looking for it. So they're actually in a worse position than they were prior to the reforms in terms of being able to move their services out west anyway. So I think the whole discussion around inner city drift, without a discussion with health, other parts of facts, without conversations with the special services, is just not going to happen, and those conversations aren't happening. So inner city drift is something that everyone's just trying to pretend isn't an issue. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, how hopeful are you that the affordable housing requirements for the developers will actually be passed? And if it is passed, will the affordable housing still belong to, say, Meriton? Or will it belong to the council involved, or will it be offered at a lower price to people who want to purchase it? And is there any consideration being given to buying into aged care developments and requiring aged care developments to also provide affordable places?
On the planning system and affordable housing, look, a few years ago, Shelter's been on about this for such a long time, and a few years ago we kept on being told by everybody to stop barking up dreamland and barking up a path that was never going to happen. But these days in the public discourse there is much more support and advocacy around inclusionary zoning, and we actually sit in our office and go, oh my goodness, is that day going to come when it might happen? So, but there's a long way between people saying that they support it and that they think it's a good idea and actually getting it implemented. There's a very long process about local councils having to agree and having to make plans saying that they have a housing need in their area and that it has to be met through an affordable and a value capture zoning system and all the rest of it. So, but I'm more optimistic than I would have been even a year ago that we might be able to pull some of this off. But there is no one size fits all or magic bullet to our housing problem as it stands now. Inclusionary zoning will only ever create a small part of the housing that is needed at affordable prices. And affordable housing can come in different ways. We talk very carefully now about affordable housing for rental, because when you have affordable housing for home ownership, and we've been supporters of some shared equity schemes and various other things, and that could happen, but I guess the gain is to the first person who buys it, because when they go on and sell it, they're selling it at the market price at the time. So if you want affordable housing in perpetuity, you're talking about affordable housing for rental, or you're talking about some of the shared equity schemes, or some of the schemes that have to do with land trusts, where people buy their house on land owned by a land trust, and the land is effectively removed from the market, and you buy your house on that land at a much lesser price than if you had to buy the land as well, but the land is held for that purpose in perpetuity by the land trust. So there's some various ways of trying to protect home ownership, quasi-home ownership type options and keep it affordable in the long run. But anyway, there's not a shortage of ideas, but there's much more engagement with this issue than there has been for some time. But we've got a long way to go.
That's it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Katherine McKernan and Mary Perkins. Katherine and Mary, what you've done is you've familiarised us with the essence of the problem. You've also inspired us because you're both working very, very hard and very, very effectively to address the phenomenon of homelessness. We wish you both more power for all the days of your wonderful work. So congratulations on the great work that you've done to date, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.